Jules De Vitto writes in a post that although there may be some similarities between the sensory processing challenges experienced by highly sensitive individuals and those with autism, there are some key differences between the two conditions. In this brief excerpt from her related podcast episode, she speaks with Robert Seegers, exploring the topic of high sensitivity compared with autism.
So welcome to today's podcast. And today I'm in conversation with Robert, who is a highly sensitive person and entrepreneur from Germany. He is the host of the Understandable podcast. And on his channel, he talks about mental health topics such as high sensitivity and neurodiversity. And with his content, he loves to provide insight through deeper self-understanding. And today, the two of us have really come together to talk about this topic of autism and autism spectrum disorder and its relationship to high sensitivity. And, what's really powerful about today's conversation is neither of us are claiming to be experts in autism. I am really an expert in high sensitivity, and although I have worked with autistic children and children on the spectrum previously, this is still a conversation that needs a lot of understanding and exploration and research. And so Robert and I are both really coming into this conversation through our personal lived experience, of course, bringing in some of the research as well. But we really want to open up the conversation and the dialogue around this topic. And we really invite anyone who is an expert in autism spectrum disorder or who can speak to the lived experience of being on the spectrum in relationship to being a highly sensitive person. We invite you to join in the dialogue. And so we really want to create this open conversation. And so I really invite you now to enjoy this podcast episode. And so something I'm really excited about today is the fact that we're going to be talking about some of the terminology and what distinguishes high sensitivity from other so-called disorders. And so I thought we could begin also by defining, what is high sensitivity? What is the highly sensitive person? And also something we'll look at today is autistic spectrum disorder. And so, to begin, would you be able to maybe define high sensitivity, the official term, which is sensory processing sensitivity?
Yes.
Then going into autistic spectrum disorder.
Yeah, of course. So it's a super interesting topic to talk about. Also about the overlap between HSPs or sensory processing sensitivity and the autistic spectrum disorder, ASD. To start with definitions, maybe you can add some as well to the HSP definition, because I think maybe you can also describe it in a more precise way than I could do. To me, or at least what I figured out after also researching a lot, is that a highly sensitive person is someone who has a heightened perception, which is created from their sensitive nervous system. This is what's creating what we call a sensory processing sensitivity. Or what would you add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the main terms I like to refer to in describing what high sensitivity is the acronym DOES. So DOES. And this is an acronym that Dr. Elaine Aron founded. And the acronym stands for D is depth of processing, the fact that we process information so deeply. O is overstimulation. So as you referred to, the fact that our nervous system tends to be overstimulated quite easily. The E stands for empathy. So the fact that we are extremely empathetic. And then this S is for sensitivity to subtleties in our environment. So the fact that we do tend to notice and be impacted by subtle environmental conditions in the external and internal environment. So that would be the simplest definition that I like to share with people. I find it summarizes it really, really nicely.
Beautiful. Yeah, it's pretty precisely to also describe those traits in detail with that definition. It's true from the current state of research what we know that both conditions are based on a spectrum. So we have highly sensitive spectrum. We also have an autistic spectrum. What I know is or at least when I refer to Elaine Aron, she says 20% of population, roughly. I think you also wrote on your blog 20 to 30%. So yeah, it depends. But it's around this number of people who are highly sensitive, who are on the sensitive or highly sensitive spectrum. When you compare that to the autistic spectrum, you just have 1 to 2% roughly of people who are on the clear autistic spectrum if you diagnose them with the guidelines from the DSM, so from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. When you take the fifth version, the actual version, then you could describe this trait within around 1 to 2% of people. And what's interesting is that if you see autism as a condition or as a disorder, same like ADHD, a lot of women are specifically undiagnosed still. There is a big discussion going on that many females especially are undiagnosed, or on the other hand, Elaine Aron says the trait, for example, in the highly sensitive trait is equally spread in men and women. And I think, at least what I observe is that many women are more to find themselves or diagnose themselves as a highly sensitive person, diagnose themselves.
Right, yeah.
That's pretty interesting.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And I really like how you're referring to both sensitivity and autism as a spectrum, right? So definitely, this is something I like to speak about a lot. So when it comes to sensitivity, a lot of people assume, well, you're either sensitive or you're not. And I really think it's important to identify that it's not a distinct category, and it does exist on a spectrum. So yeah, we can be highly sensitive. There are those who are mediumly sensitive, and then those who are low on the sensitivity spectrum. And of course, it's because it is a spectrum and a range, we can move in between those categories too at different times in our lives. And also, autism exists on a spectrum, right? So from my perspective, these are not distinct categories. And of course, there can be overlap. And I like to speak of sensitivity as a framework too, rather than a label. It's a framework that helps us understand our lived experience. So with that, there's a bit more flexibility and fluidity in the term and the temperament. And so, yeah, I'm curious what your perspective on that is as well, in terms of it being a distinct category or label.
When you, for example, look into my community, I just I got a comment from someone, and my community, for example, is convinced that a main difference between those two is that the highly sensitive traits, or people are more born with highly sensitive traits, and autistic traits are something people learned, are more kind of coping strategies people learned in the early years. And that's one of the main differences. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I find it fascinating. And this is where it really highlights a gap for me in the research, or the fact that there does need to be much more research in this area. Because my speciality is high sensitivity, right? So I can really speak to the research in terms of being a highly sensitive person, and the fact it is believed to be an innate temperament. So it's something we are born with. However, the environmental conditions of our childhood are also what influence how that temperament is expressed in a person, right? So as a highly sensitive person, if we are born in a very nourishing and healthy environment, then the research has shown that we tend to flourish and go on to thrive later in life. It's something known as vantage sensitivity, the fact that we're more likely to thrive and flourish later in life than the average person. But if we are born into a challenging or difficult childhood environment, then we're more likely to experience, anxiety, depression, or mental health struggles later in life. So in terms of being a highly sensitive person, it's both innate and it depends on our environment. So it's both nature and nurture. And I would also add into that because a lot of the work I explore is about the spiritual aspect too, our psycho-spiritual journey in life. And I would add there's a soul dimension to that too. And then in terms of being on the autistic spectrum, my understanding has always been that it is also both nature and nurture. It's something innate, it's something we're born with, and also the environment will impact, again, how that individual is able to navigate those challenges. So I think, it's really important to identify it's not one or the other, but both impact how the trait is expressed.
So I think what's fascinating is, I read that a lot as well, that there is this gap in research that we have not, still, we know a lot of things, but it's still kind of unclear. It's still blurry. Also, when we talk about the overlap, for example, of, on the one hand, sensory processing sensitivity, of autism, and as well of other conditions like anxiety disorders, CPTSD, of complex post-traumatic stress disorder, what is actually, where does one trait belong to? Where is actually one thing coming from? And I think there is a lot of missing research when I look into literature. And I feel that people like you, for example, who talk a lot about those things openly, especially on podcasts and social media, that people like you bring the topic way further than actual science does, which is interesting because we get real world feedback according to that gap in research.
Thanks for listening. See the Creative Mind post for this podcast episode with links to resources and other material.